Also, just wanted to say, me and Joseph have gone to a couple of Indian tournaments the past few months, and in all of the tournaments we joined, uh, everyone was great. All the motions were fantastic, and this one is uh, not different from any of those. So thank you guys. You guys have a great circuit. That's it. I'll start in three, two. Oops, sorry. Wait. Oops. Okay, I'll start in three, two, and one. The world is in a unique position where the United States is operated by an incredibly volatile individual whose positions on geopolitics are rather uncertain. But inasmuch as that is the case, the unfortunate reality is the United States is still the number one powerhouse in the world, and if the EU decides to go contrary to the number one powerhouse, then the only people that they make better is the enemies of these particular countries. I think government bench fails to understand a very simple premise. Sometimes it's just far better and far more strategic when you don't speak or let your opinion be heard, because that is what allows for you the flexibility that you need in order to put yourself in the best possible position on either side of the house. Because let's be clear, the fact remains is that if any point the Trump administration sees the EU as someone that opposes their ideals or current objectives, that is precisely the point in which the US starts to devalue a lot of the strategic economic relationships that it has with the EU. Gov is obsessed with their main impact being economic development and economic independence on the side of the EU. But what we would posit is that A, you can probably just do economics better on side opposition, but B, peace in the actual Russia-Ukraine conflict is just a lot more likely to happen if they decide to not be so obvious of their hatred of Russia. Before I get into that extension, a couple of responses to the previous, to all of government bench. One, PM explains and gives reasons as to why the EU needs to stand independently from the US. I have two problems with this. The first neg is that they should be able to prop up their own industries in dealing with the Russia-Ukraine war. The first response is that this mechanism, the first response is in the first mechanism that Prime Minister ironically himself said in his speech. If it is true that the EU is also suffering from decay, it sounds as if that support from the biggest, largest, and most capable economy for giving aid is probably what's going to be within the proximate interest of the EU because of how hard it is to support and prop up all of these industries that Gov says is like happening, right? I literally think that PM forgot that he contradicted himself because in the first 2 minutes of his speech, he talks about how badly the EU economy is, while in the next breath magically asserts that it's going to be able to prop up all of those very attractive markets that currently don't exist. The second problem with PM's first argument is in how it makes so much easier Russia to justify aggression in the future now that the EU is just a lot more aggressive in calling out their hatred for Russia. Note, NATO is probably the main reason why the war was actually just contained only within Ukraine. The problem with Gov's anti-American stance is that bit by bit, it justifies the US stepping away from the conflict and leaving the EU to deal with Russia all on its own. Secondly, PM, to a large extent, asserts like 15 arguments as to why we should do this. Note panel that they are all contingent and outcome independent on aligned interests. But since we all don't just sing kumbaya and hold hands in the real world, what Seth mentioned is valid. It is unstrategic to be divisive and escalatory in nature to this particular country. What then is our positive material? First, keeping the stability of the euro by not entrenching ourselves in further war and conflict that increases the cost of goods and valuable commodities given the inflationary landscape we are in. Secondly, keeping the relative peace for the EU as a collective and its member states. This means that if you condemn Russia, you escalate their capacities and tensions to wreck Ukraine and all of their allies within the proximate area of the region. War and terror is not good, and side government throws fuel to that fire. Third and lastly, we have to be diplomatic to bolster European GDP, which is a function of imports and exports to the US and the rest of the world. Sef's POI was how going to the war is inflationary and bad for the world. It might be good for Ukraine and bad for Russia, but the average European or person in the world gets significantly harmed. The extension. Why the EU is not a monolith, minor countries found within it will majority suffer if the US pulls out and becomes less supportive to them, leading to a weaker stance for the EU. Why is this true? The first and most obvious reason is that this independent stance makes it a lot more easy for Russia to deal with and skew things in their favor. The reason why Russia and Ukraine is in direct favor marginally within Ukraine is because of Western unity and how both are able to agree on decisions when it comes to them. That is to say, a lot of the regulatory measures that existed within status quo, e.g. the sanctions that the vast majority of countries imposed on Russia like 3 years ago, only worked insofar as the entire Western world was in agreement on what to do. Why is it important then that this partnership stays? The EU lacks the military, economic, and political strength to challenge Russia all on its own, or at the very least, they are not capable of condemning Russia all on its own. It needs to align with the US interests at the point in which NATO is probably the most important strategic pact that the EU must sustain. Absent this codependency, the EU just lost its biggest veto power in telling Russia to stop its malevolent practices. This harm leads to less power for the EU, not more. The second reason why this relationship is important is because of the opportunity costs that exist on Gov. Like, note how all very fantastical their policies are. The EU currently does not have a unified military. It currently is only able to offer a marginal percentage of aid that goes to the US. First and foremost, the EU states probably care more about their own domestic economies as opposed to putting their country's economies on the line. Why is this a bad harm? Because inasmuch as Gov thinks the EU is a monolith, there are really only 5 countries fully capable of not being in direct partnership with the US. Absent this, all of those other countries within Central Europe or the Balkans are now put into a very bad position at the point in which they have no more support or marginal support from the US. Before the third reason, go.
If your idea is that countries within the EU don't want it to do this, probably on the comparative, a lot of countries within the EU also don't want it to align with the US.
I mean, but the weighing metric here is just on who gets to decide, or which side is a lot more safer and a lot more secure for all of these EU member states, right? And that's what we're saying is true. The last reason why this is true is because status quo is marginally better. Inasmuch as the EU have more of an incentive in direct backlash and opposition to Russia, what Joseph highlights in his speech is that a strategic and more ambiguous stance allows for the further development of diplomacy within these states. Absent this, you are just more likely to make Russia mad, make discourse impossible, which eventually results in the war prolonging. Why is this mech important? A lot of what DPM's extension was in explaining how current measures are not enough. This is just false, right? Currently, the war is almost over and talks are happening about making it end. While it certainly isn't the perfect concession on the side of the world if Russia decides that they are not the aggressor, at the very least it stops all of the conflict from happening. What the EU does when it makes their independent stance is it prolongs all of these conflicts from happening. We say on our side, as a consequence of all of the positive material that we give to you, it's probably better for the EU to just say, yes, we agree with the US. For all of those reasons, oppose.